today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking with a Ukrainian journalist, Olga Tokariuk. Ms. Tokariuk is an independent journalist who is a fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, England. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Her professional interests include international relations and disinformation research. Olga Tokariuk, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I'm delighted you're with me today. I know you're based in England, but you still have contacts in Ukraine, obviously. Just overall, how do you assess what is going on in Ukraine? I know it's a long distance overview of what's happening, but just briefly, how do you assess the situation right now?
Yes, you're right. I've been in the UK for a couple of months, but all my family is still in Ukraine, so I'm in touch with them every day and I receive the updates from the ground. So the war has been going on for 10 months already. Russia's initial goals have failed. Obviously, Russia failed to occupy all of Ukraine's territory. Russia failed to occupy a major part of Ukraine's territory. Actually, Russia failed to overthrow the Ukrainian government. And in fact, the Ukrainian armed forces have shown that they are remarkably capable of going on counteroffensive and reconquered half of the territory that Russia initially seized. So there were impressive counteroffensives of the Ukrainian forces in the eastern part, in Kharkiv region, back in September. In November, Kherson in the south of Ukraine has been liberated by the Ukrainian forces. So Ukraine is winning on the battlefield. However, Russia is targeting Ukrainian civilians, increasingly unable to to defeat the Ukrainian armed forces. Russia targets civilians and tries to destroy Ukrainian energy infrastructure in order to make civilian population freeze and stay in the winter without electricity, without heating, without water supply.
It's certainly a devastating situation. Back when the Russians really weren't threatening to invade, they kept saying they weren't going to. Putin said he wasn't. Joe Biden was one of the few people who didn't believe Putin and said they were going to invade, and Joe Biden was correct, it looks like, in this situation. But so many people were saying that the Ukrainians just could not hold up against one of the best armies, theoretically the best armies in the world, one of the largest armies in the world. But it's just been absolutely devastating, has it not, for the Russian army that was supposedly so powerful. And now we see almost how inept they are. In fact, Putin had to draft 300,000 draftees who really had no military training to send them to Ukraine. But that, along with the resiliency of the Ukrainian people, have to be two of the greatest surprises, I would think, right?
Yes, absolutely. You know, we shouldn't forget that this war did not start on the 24th February of this year, but it started back in 2014. So Ukraine had 8 years to reform its armed forces, to, provide them with more modern equipment, to train them according to NATO standards. And in fact, many reforms have been implemented in Ukraine's armed forces in this 8 years. And we are seeing the results now that the Ukrainian army has showed that they are capable of leadership on various levels. It is not a centralized command structure like the Russian army. The Ukrainian commanders on the ground are capable of making their own independent decisions. Very often these decisions are creative, are innovative, and they are just outsmarting Russian forces that are bigger in size, that have more weapons, but they are not as flexible and as modern thinking, forward thinking as the Ukrainian armed forces. And of course, a big role also plays the Ukrainian society, Ukrainian civil society that mobilized to support this resistance effort. Huge numbers of people every day participate in this resistance effort by donating their money to support the armed forces. Many of them volunteered to fight. Some others volunteered to take care of civilian population. They go to the front line, to dangerous places to bring their food and basic necessities. So it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that whole of Ukraine is fighting in this war, not just Ukraine's armed forces.
It certainly is. It's certainly a mobilized effort, and one that's been extremely resilient up to this point, and hopefully will continue to do so. Well, so many actors who are not in Ukraine, I guess some who are in Ukraine and Russia, are saying, when will the war, or they're asking, when will the war end? And that's a legitimate question. I don't think anybody has the answer, but what suggestions have you heard in your professional setting and elsewhere are from Ukrainians as to how to end the war? What can be done to bring it to a conclusion, and certainly not to cede victory to Russia, I would think?
Well, Ukrainians definitely want this war to end as soon as possible. Millions of Ukrainians have become refugees. They are scattered around the world, and many of them are waiting actually for the war to end to return to Ukraine. They don't want to stay forever in other countries. And of course, those civilians who are still in Ukraine, who made the choice to stay, many of them are with children. They are also very much hopeful that Ukrainian armed forces will prevail soon and the war will end. They are ready to suffer even in the winter in the freezing conditions without electricity. Blackouts can last up to 40 hours due to Russian attacks. But these people stay because they believe in Ukraine's victory. What is needed to, achieve this victory? Well, first of all, more pressure on Russia, more pressure in terms of financial pressure, more sanctions on Russia, more pressure on Russian economy so that they do not have enough money to finance this war effort. And then, of course, more support, more weapons to Ukraine. This war can only end when Russia is defeated and it withdraws from the occupied territories of Ukraine. It cannot end with some sort of a halfway agreement, because that peace will not be tenable. We've seen already since 2014 that Russia violated Minsk agreements, the peace agreements that were signed in 2015. Russia showed that it doesn't care about this, about the peace agreements. It is openly now stating its desire to destroy Ukraine as an independent state. The war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine equal, according to some estimates, to a genocide of Ukrainian people. So it is clear that Russia has no intention to end this war. This war can only be ended when Russia is defeated and withdraws from Ukraine.
What do you think was Putin's motivations? I know it's hard to get inside his head, but what do you think motivated him to invade Ukraine? He's been threatening, and there's been a low-scale, low-waged war going on for years over in the eastern parts of Ukraine. But what do you think actually finally motivated him to take such drastic, irrational action?
Well, Putin laid out his motivations in an article that he published last year on, which was entitled "On the Historical Unity of Ukrainian and Russian People," in which he basically argues that Ukrainian people do not exist, that these are just Russian people, that Ukraine, modern independent Ukraine, has become an anti-Russia, which is threatening Russia, and therefore it has to be destroyed. So Putin is, just an embodiment of the Russian imperialist and colonial policy towards Ukraine that was there for centuries. During the history, Russia attempted on many occasions to destroy Ukrainian culture, destroy Ukrainian identity. There was a genocide of Ukrainian people in 1930s perpetrated by Joseph Stalin, who ordered an artificial famine, Holodomor, which killed at least 3 million Ukrainians. So this is not the first attempt to crush, Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian state. And we are seeing that this effort is failing because it is based on some delusional premises. We are clearly seeing that Ukrainians and Russians are not the same people, that Ukrainians have their own very distinct identity, which is not as much based on a language or ethnicity, but which is based on values of freedom, of democracy, of human rights. And some of the other reasons why Putin thought delusionally that he will succeed and that Russian army will be able to overtake Ukraine very quickly, I think these reasons are rooted in the impunity that Russia faced for all the previous wars it waged in the past 20 years. Wars in Chechnya, war in Georgia, war in Ukraine that started in 2014. Putin didn't expect the reaction of the West. Putin didn't expect the solidarity that the Western world will show with Ukraine. So, the impunity, the detachment from reality, and the Russian centuries-long imperial policy, in my view, are the explanations why he started this war.
You're right. This war started long before the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, without a doubt. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer and you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking with a journalist, a Ukrainian journalist, who is currently living in Oxford, England, and getting an update on the Ukrainian situation. Olga Tokariuk is an independent Ukrainian journalist, and she's also a fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford. Olga, we're talking about the war, and really it's been remarkable to see how the Ukrainians have come together. The well-trained Ukrainian army has performed so well, but you're getting a lot of assistance from outside, namely from the European Union, from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, from United Nations agencies, just a wide range of folks who are involved in this effort. How strong has that support been, and do you expect it to stay strong into the immediate future?
Well, of course, the support of the Western countries and institutions have been crucial in maintaining Ukraine's ability to resist Russian aggression. But, what needs to be stressed is that Ukraine is not only fighting for itself. Ukraine is fighting for the values of the democratic and free world. Ukraine is the last curtain that separates, the free world and the barbaric, tyrannical world that Russia embodies. Ukrainian soldiers are sacrificing their own lives to stop Russian aggression from spreading to other countries. When we listen to Russian officials, to Russian propagandists on state-controlled media, they are explicitly saying that, they have also some grievances about the Baltic states or about Poland. And these countries, they really appreciate that that there are Ukrainian armed forces and that the Ukrainian society is resisting and is fighting Russia, is protecting them. So it's not just Ukraine that relies on the support and on the assistance of other countries. It's also other countries who are feeling safer now because of Ukrainians and because Ukrainians are fighting and resisting. And actually, in terms of the cost that this assistance of Ukraine, is worth for the US or other countries, these costs are not that huge. There were some estimates that those costs are really not as big compared to the cost of inaction, compared to the cost of not helping Ukraine.
Exactly, it certainly is. There's been a considerable discussion especially in the United States and maybe in the UK, I'm not sure, but there's been a focus also on the role of the United Nations. And we've seen the UN Security Council has been semi-paralyzed up to this point, and it's basically because of the way that it's structured. But by the same token, the United Nations agencies, the UN World Food Program, the UN Children's Fund, the UN Refugee Agency, the International Atomic Energy Agency, these are all frontline UN agencies that have provided assistance to millions, tens of millions of Ukrainians. And does that get covered in Ukraine? I think part of the problem is that there's not as much up-to-date information on the United Nations in the United States as there may be in other parts of the world, especially in developing countries. But in Ukraine, do they see the UN as being someone who's there to provide assistance?
Well, unfortunately, I have to admit that the perception in Ukraine is that the UN is not doing enough. Of course, first of all, it refers to the UN Security Council, which is, as you said, paralyzed because of the veto that Russia has, and also China, that one of the UN Security Council members is the country that has clearly committed a crime of aggression, that has clearly violated the UN Charter and the basic principles of international law. So, there are questions, of course, raised in Ukraine. Why do we need the UN Security Council? What is the role of the UN Security Council in the modern world if one of its permanent members is allowed to commit crimes of aggression and violations of international law and get away with complete impunity? Then, in terms of the activity of other UN organizations, I think the most appreciated and covered is the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency and its head, who has visited the nuclear power plant in the south of Ukraine, in Zaporizhia, that has been occupied by Russian forces, and there were fears of a nuclear disaster on that plant. And there is a mediation effort, negotiation effort in progress to secure the facility and possibly to hand it over to a neutral team of experts, or to ensure, in the best case scenario, the withdrawal of Russian armed forces, Russian soldiers from the facility, and withdrawal of weapons that are stationed there, putting in danger not just Ukraine, but all of Europe. In terms of other UN agencies, I would say that there is also some criticism inside Ukraine that they are not doing enough, that it's mostly the local volunteers, local NGOs that are more engaged in a relief effort. They are those who are more willing to risk their lives and go to the most dangerous places, and sometimes their cars get blown up on the landmines that Russians leave after withdrawing from previously occupied Ukrainian territories. And there is less presence of international organizations. I would say that the impression we get from the media in Ukraine is that actually it's the local organizations that are helping civilians more than international organizations.
Oh, okay. Well, it's interesting. Those are fair concerns, and I think that we need to focus on them. But it's sort of been a schizophrenic relationship between the United Nations agencies, frontline agencies, and the Security Council. The Security Council, as I mentioned, has been semi-paralyzed, but so many of these agencies have provided, like the World Food Program, to over 5 million Ukrainians, the UN Children's Fund, health services to something like 6 or 7 million Ukrainians. So it's a yin-yang type of arrangement. But before we run out of time, I want to check with you on your studies that you have done, the research you've done on misinformation, disinformation, and that type of thing. We have an immense amount of that in the United States right now. We're awash in it, so we could be a case study for misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies, to be quite honest. But what are some of the most salient points of your research?
Well, if to sum up very briefly what we are observing in the information space since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we can conclude that Russia's effort to, with the use of propaganda and disinformation, to undermine Western support to Ukraine has failed. So the disinformation that Russia is using to erode the solidarity with Ukraine so far was not successful. However, outside of the Western world, if we look at the countries of the global South, especially Brazil, South Africa, or India, just to name a few, this disinformation campaign and propaganda campaign sponsored by Russian state has been much more successful. And I think there are several reasons for that. Of course, the historical links of these countries with the former Soviet Union and then Russia, their own anti-Western or anti-imperialist grievances, and economic reasons, and maybe also less awareness about the history of the region, history of Ukraine as an independent state, and Ukraine's own anti-imperialist, anti-colonial struggle. So the focus on combating disinformation, I think, should be concentrated on those parts of the world. And another thing that I want to mention is that Ukraine and the Ukrainian government, the civil society, and just individual people have been incredibly successful also in countering Russian disinformation online using various tools such as humor as well. And actually that's my research project here at the Reuters Institute in Oxford. I will be studying on how Ukrainians used humor as a tool to combat Russian disinformation.
Well, we're down to our last couple of minutes, and we're talking about the solidarity of large groups around the world to support the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military. That there may be a crack in that coming in because the Republican-led Congress that was recently elected has indicated that they are looking at cutting aid to Ukraine. And the theme that you hear so often, the mantra is no blank check. But in reality, it has not been a blank check for the Ukrainians. It is not nearly as much money spent in Ukraine as some people have declared. But what do you think can be done to overcome so much of the misinformation and disinformation that is awash in this country, and certainly awash in Russia, and I'm sure there's some in Ukraine also?
Well, I think it has to do with the democracy crisis in the US and in other Western countries. You know, so much of it and of these statements, they come from internal politics and internal divisions and the internal polarization that exists in the US and that probably has deepened in recent years. But my hope is that ultimately the cool-headed approach will prevail, and even the simple cost-benefits analysis will demonstrate that it is in the U.S. interest to continue supporting Ukraine, to continue standing up to Russian aggression, and that the cost of not doing it will be much higher because if Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, which country will be next? Will an attack on NATO country will be next? In that case, of course, the cost for the US and for all NATO will be much higher. So, I really hope that this is just a political rhetoric and used to mobilize the supporters ahead of the elections. And then when these people are actually in power, they will look at the situation with a cooler head and they will not cut support to Ukraine, and they will maintain the solidarity and they continue the assistance to Ukraine. Because as I said, Ukraine is not just fighting for itself. Ukraine is fighting for all world democracies.
It is certainly a united effort and one that needs to be supported. But Olga Tokariuk, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much, Bill. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.